Greetings and welcome to The Hidden Palace, the show where we talk with experts and enthusiasts about video game preservation. My name is Bo, and I am joined by DRX. DRX, welcome.
What's up?
And we have with us a special guest. It's Biolaser.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our topic today is the video game Spore, about which Biolaser is both an expert and an enthusiast. And the setup for this is Hidden Palace released a prototype of Spore that was very significant to the Spore community recently. So to start, what is Spore? What kind of game is it? Who published it? Who developed it?
Okay, so Spore is a God game that was developed by Maxis. Maxis is a subsidiary of EA, specifically Maxis Emeryville. A lot of gamers will probably know them from Sims. Maxis developed all the Sims games. They still develop the Sims games. SimCity, they were very involved with that. Spore was released in September of 2008 to great fanfare, but it was in development a lot earlier than that. The development cycle for Spore went on almost a decade. There were all manner of pre-release videos that EA Emeryville put out, that Maxis put out. We knew a lot about the direction that Spore was going prior to its release, but it's a God game. It's essentially a game where you can take a single organism from like a single cellular being all the way through and create like a spacefaring empire out of that. So a lot of the core gameplay is taking your creature, using these editors to take different parts and make your creature look however you want. You can be a herbivore, you can be a carnivore, going through from the cell stage into the creature stage, hunting other creatures, befriending them, eating meat, plants, fish, anything like that. Then eventually you start to accrue more intelligence in your creature, and your creature starts to become smarter. So your race eventually goes from just like a predatory animal or a herbivore animal, and you start using tools. That's when you kind of enter into the tribal stage. From there, you start fighting other creatures who have evolved to that level and have that level of intelligence. And that continues on all the way through space. You go into the civilization stage, you're fighting amongst cities. Then you go to the space stage and you're a spacefaring empire. So Spore's core gameplay is both creative, in that you can make your creature look however you want. You can kind of play the game and design your species however strategically you want to approach it, be it very peaceful and very friendly, or very violent, or some kind of combination of both. And then it's taking your creature and evolving it, increasing its power, its intelligence, and its influence. Eventually, you control your whole planet. Then you can go from there, control a whole galactic cluster, a little area of solar systems, all the way to taking over the entire galaxy if you want. So it's both a very granular game in that you can control the details of what your creature looks like, and it's also a very macro game, kind of like a strategy game where you can kind of plan the development of your species and of how you're going to manage it, and go all the way to that, galactic faring civilization level, which is kind of the end game.
I see. So you said it was in development for over a decade. So that means, I think, that it was around the same time that Maxis is thinking about The Sims, which was a big breakout for them.
Yes. So actually, there is a lot in common between the Sims and Spore when it comes to not only like the development phase, but also how the games are managed. So database packed files. This is a dot package file. It's a specific type of file format that EA uses in both Sims games and Spore in Spore. When Spore was in development and when Spore came out, we knew it was very related to The Sims is the presence of these package files. Both SimCity 4 and The Sims 2 use package files. They're both also developed by Maxis. And we have a lot of knowledge very early on when Spore was first released in 2008 about partly how the game functions, but also the very early stages of modding because of these package files. So Spore was in development for a long time, and a lot of the early stages of development are a little amorphous right now. We don't know a lot about, how the game was shaping up years before release. We know a lot more closer to the final release of kind of what the game looked like, not only because of the prototype, but also because of development previews that were shown at various conferences, the Game Developers Conference in 2005 being a big one. But To answer the question about directly, relations between The Sims and Spore, very closely together. A lot of our reverse engineering of retail Spore comes from SimCity 2013 as well. That was kind of an infamous SimCity title that was made in the same Spark game engine that Spore was developed in. And a lot of our information, and especially our early information about how the game could be modded, about how the game works, comes from SimCity 2013. So earlier Sims titles, definitely related to Spore, use similar package file formats, definitely some overlap between, the structure of the games. Later Sims titles like SimCity 13, exactly the same engine as Spore. Lots of Spore, gameplay and development information can be pulled directly from that game.
Are they distinct teams within Maxis working on these games, do we know? Or is it there's the Spore team off in the lab somewhere and then the Sims team elsewhere? Or do you see cross pollination in the credits?
Definitely cross pollination. A lot of people who worked on Spore also worked on The Sims. In fact, the same exact team, Maxis Emeryville, was the primary developer of SimCity 2013. So they had a lot of background with the Spark engine. We largely know that it's called the Spark engine from some of the developers using that term. Also, of course, the Spore prototype and information from SimCity 2013. So definitely cross pollination. With that team, it was the same exact team that developed SimCity 2013, which at first, when that game came out, it was also a game that was released to great fanfare. And SimCity 2013 had some issues related to like online connectivity. I'm not really a huge Sims fan, so I'm sure there's a more detailed analysis of that. But in terms of context for Spore, we were particularly interested very early in SimCity 2013 because it was in our game engine. And you have to understand, Spark is a very unique game engine with very little documentation. It's not something like Unreal or Frostbite that, there's been a lot said on it. A lot of people have, cracked it open and looked at how it works. Spark was a mystery for a while. And SimCity 2013 being in the Spark engine definitely allowed us to pull a lot of vital information that would eventually be turned into some of our modding tools. But in terms of just like Maxis's team and how they were like operating on their development cycle, we know that there was a lot of cross pollination between the different teams. I believe, again, I'm not really a huge Sims fan, but I believe Maxis still is the primary developer of The Sims now. I know that they've largely been at this point kind of put into a kind of larger EA structure, but they still do technically exist, even though a lot of the Spore devs have long moved on to other studios, and they are, I'd say, most known to modern gamers for The Sims, but a lot of people definitely remember Maxis too for Spore, because Spore is kind of such a cult classic.
And you mentioned there was a 2005 conference where earlier Spore was shown off. Is that the first inkling that the public got about it, or are there earlier artifacts that suggest it was in development?
Oh, there's definitely earlier artifacts. We know a lot about the kind of period when Spore was starting to shape up, but a lot of articles, even recent articles, have been written on like the very early ideas for Spore. Will Wright had conversations with journalists in the early 2000s where he talked about this God game that he was making. There's a specific article in the New York Times, I believe, in 2004, where he was pressed a little bit on kind of like the structure of this game. They were very curious about the evolution aspect of it, how big it was going to be. I think the big takeaway from Spore's or early advertising and early hype, especially around Will Wright, was that they were building expectations very early. And that all came to a head in 2005 and 2006 with the Game Developers Conference. In the Spore community, we kind of consider those events not only watershed events, but also kind of infamous, because this is what turned the hype up to Spore to 10,000. People saw the early demos they had of this game, and they established expectations about what Spore was going to be, and they set those expectations into the stratosphere. They were very impressed with the technology. They were extremely impressed with the visuals and the intended gameplay loop and all of these things that was explained. And if you look at how some of the devs that worked on Spore talk about that period now. Like I said, there were articles released very recently in the last couple of months about this, talking about Spore's development. A lot of them thought that they overpromised. And 2005 and 2006 were critical years because what they showed the gaming world absolutely wowed them. Journalists were writing all kinds of articles about this amazing, incredible, large concept game that was being developed. It was going to shatter all of these expectations. And in the Spore community, we kind of call this the false promise, because is I think a lot of people would agree that the retail Spore that we got, the game that we got, was a far cry from what people thought was promised at the time. Now, at the same time, Spore was very commercially successful, and I would say even more than being a cult classic, it's still remembered by so many people. There's a lot of players that even, had a cursory glance at Spore that still remember it because of the way it sticks with you. But even I'd say a lot of diehard Spore fans recognize that what EA and Maxis and the games journalists at the time that were writing about Spore described the demo versions or described the early versions of the game, how they described that was very different than what was released. So in terms of advertising and media and getting the word out about Spore, they were great at that. But I think a lot of people recognize that what they promised maybe was not what was delivered. So we know that some parts of this were in full development at the time. Some of the things that they promised did pan out, but a lot of what maybe the scale of the game and how it was described at the time definitely didn't pan out towards release, and you can definitely see some of the evidence in the prototype as to really how far along they were by February 2008.
So yeah, they've scaled back ambitions at some point, and maybe if you were not paying attention to the pre-release stuff, you didn't know that you're missing out on things. But if you were tuned into it, then you feel like there was something left on the table.
Yeah, I remember there was so much hype in like gaming magazines and even TV. Like, oh, this is gonna be like the greatest game of all time.
They had great advertising. They hired a great advertising firm to do all of like the media. They had posters up. You can go through, the streets of LA and San Francisco, and you could see that we have pictures in our archive of like these Spore advertisements like up on the wall with like pictures of these zany alien creatures on them. They had, they blew the gaming world open when they did that demo. And I don't want to take away any credit from the Spore developers, because we have a great relationship with EA. We have a great relationship with the Spore devs. We love Spore. Obviously, we've dedicated a significant amount of time to, modding and being involved with this game. But I definitely think the developers themselves recognize that maybe they overpromised. In some of the recent statements from the EA developers, they were particularly worried about the state of the creature creator at GDC in 2005. So they described having this creature creator, and it was in its early stages, but they more or less faked the UI over it. So all of the elements that you were actually seeing of like clicking on these different parts and adding them and all of this like really fancy stuff and these stats that were coming up, that was more or less like completely made up at the time over like a very early version of the creature editor that they had. And some of these Spore devs were even talking about how when Will Wright was up there giving this amazing presentation, they were like, wow, they're going to think that, we have this like rare and ready to go right now, that it's, about to be shipped with all these amazing features, and maybe we overpromised a little. So that is absolutely not to diminish their efforts whatsoever. But I think the hype bubble and the expectations around Spore were definitely set by the media and definitely set by EA and Maxis personnel and their interactions with the media, describing what the game was going to be like long before any of those systems were actually solidly put in place.
It sounds to me like there was significant budget behind this game. Like they poured not only years of development into it, but lots into the marketing and lots into overhauling it.
That's exactly correct. And actually, Will Wright recently, in the one interview that he did do, said that money was not a problem whatsoever. And it's funny because I think that a lot of people, maybe that are far more critical of retail Spore than the modding community, have often kind of established this myth that maybe it was budget cuts, like maybe it was the suits at EA that finally said, all right, release the game and cut back on what they were going to spend on that. And there's just no evidence of that whatsoever. Actually, quite on the contrary, they had plenty of money. They were flushed with money. They had lots of resources at EA. They had a very talented team. So I think that if they had a lower budget, I don't think the game would have ever even been, the retail version that we have and the great game that we all love and enjoy. But I definitely think that anyone who looks at Spore's development cycle and thinks, wow, EA really messed with them. EA is really to blame for, either rushing it or, not giving them a high enough budget. Both of those things are incorrect. EA was incredibly patient with Maxis and Will Wright. EA gave them a lot of time to make this game, and they gave them quite a bit of funding to do it. So that was definitely not something that Maxis Emeryville struggled with during the cycle, development cycle of Spore.
All right, so let's turn to the prototype version of Spore that we've been referring to. So this is a pre-release build that Hidden Palace put out. Was it at the end of last year or the beginning of this year?
Beginning of this year.
So tell us about that from your end, DRX. You got hold of this, and did you understand that it would be so significant to this community, or did you have to reach out to find the experts and enthusiasts?
Yeah, so I actually got Spore when it released, and I enjoyed Spore a lot. And I was always kind of on the lookout for a prototype. At some point, a long-time contributor to the site happened upon a pretty early prototype of Spore, and so I was like pretty excited about that. And actually, for a long time, we couldn't get it to work. Well, I couldn't get it to work because it was Spore used something called Securom, which is like an anti-piracy software that made it so that you can't copy the retail version and just like so. But the way it worked is you had to have the like actual press CD of the game, and it does a bunch of checks. So for a long time, I actually couldn't get it to work, and so I had to like figure out how to hack around this. But yeah, I knew of its significance right away. But what I didn't know is that there were still fans of the game, because you don't hear about Spore much nowadays. If you're, even in classic game communities, I think there's also like a lot of the like retro gaming is focused on consoles. Like I actually, for whatever reason, it's very hard to find PC games. And in many ways, 2026 is kind of the year of PC prototypes, as you'll see. We have some more stuff coming. And so I spent some time looking around the internet, like forums, like different places that could enjoy this. I found a couple Discords that were like very active, like way more than I expected. And I started hanging out there, and I realized that, I think this would be probably pretty fun for them to dig into. Like until the release, I wasn't sure if it was actually going to be a hit or a miss, but it turns out it was quite because it was like their first prototype, right? Like one thing that happens with some of these games is because there was never a prototype of a game released before. Like there isn't like a whole community around the prototype game, the prototypes, right? Like for Sonic, there's so many prototypes that people have kind of grown up on researching them, like reverse engineering. But for Spore, it was more around like modding the retail game, right? So you kind of never know if it's going to resonate with the community or not.
So yeah, Biolaser, tell us about how did you receive the news of the prototype, and what was significant about it to you and to the modding scene?
Yeah, so the arrival of the Spore prototype, which we immediately labeled it F08 for when it came out February 08, that's kind of like the internal name we gave it, couldn't have come at a better time for our community. It's interesting because Spore modding was definitely not in its infancy when the prototype arrived. We have a SDK that we can use for code injection to make mods. We had at that time reverse engineered quite a bit of the game. We had a very talented team member and software engineer, EMD, who essentially designed all of our Spore modding tools, the modern ones, at least Spore Modder FX and the Spore Mod API SDK. So we have tools to inject code into the games. We have a custom launcher. We have tools to unpack those package files I talked about for more data modding. EMD personally went through and did the painstaking process of manual reverse engineering from data from SimCity 2013, but also just like going through and looking at assembly and finding out what functions did. So when the prototype hit, we had a pretty good understanding of this game. We had strong tools to mod it. We had a dedicated community, and we had lots of very talented people. And at the end of the day, we love this game too. Even though I definitely recognize that it didn't live up maybe to the hype that some people set for it, I personally love Spore. The modding community loves Spore. So a lot of passion was there too. So when the prototype hit, it was received extremely well right away. I actually remember very distinctly when that channel went up in the Spore modded community Discord server. We had actually already been talking about it because we had heard some rumors that like the stream was happening and everything. And like people looked into it right away. People were downloading it, people were playing it. And then on the development side, people were looking at it and looking at things like, oh, there's a PDB file. When that was discovered, that was like, a huge moment for us because we're like, wow, we can crack this thing open and do so much with it. I remember reading messages being like, oh, there's debug symbols. And like, it's like people's eyes were widening. People were just like thinking about all the stuff we were going to be able to do with this. So it was such an interesting reaction because you could definitely see the different kind of faces of the Spore community. You had people that were downloading it and playing it right away and being like, oh my God, look at the differences in the cell stage. Oh my God, look at all of these different ways that the game differs and how I can interact with it. Then on the more dev side, you were seeing modders like salivating over the concept of looking at these debug symbols and using them to learn more about the retail game and to make mods. So I definitely think all corners of the community were celebrating, and for different reasons, and everyone had a reason to kind of like look into this right away. Some people wanted to play it, some people wanted to crack it open right away and see how it worked.
And for the non-engineers in the audience, the PDB file is very significant because it will tell you the names of the pieces of code and some indication of how they interact. Because without those, you are sort of fumbling around in the dark and having to guess and having to experiment and having to do a lot of trial and error to figure out even what a piece of code is doing. But if you have a name for it, if you have a label for what it's supposed to do, your work is 10, 100 times easier.
It's like the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, exactly.
Very significant. And so gameplay wise, do we have some of the elements that were there prior to the scale back in the final release?
Yes, so that's a very interesting question. So, when it came to looking at the Spore prototype, a lot of people were definitely looking for cut content right away. And I can say some content is definitely there, some content is definitely not there. Getting back to the famous conference in 2005, GDC 2005, and then 2006, one of the main things that they showed off there was something that appeared to be like an underwater level. It was a creature swimming around in the water that was not the cell stage. It was more advanced than that. The cell stage is immediately followed by the creature stage. And this was named the aquatic stage by a lot of people in the Spore community. And this became an absolute myth in the Spore community, the idea of this aquatic stage. People thought that it existed. People thought that it was like right and ready to be in the game and that Maxis or EA cut it at the very end. And to the modding community, it kind of became like a bit of a joke to us because we always explained to people that the aquatic stage was never really a real thing. We actually found out later from like a mismatch of interviews and way that Maxis devs were talking about their, process of making the game, that demo in 2005 and then another one in 2006, the aquatic stage, or that aquatic level that we saw that was distinctly not the cell stage in those demos, were actually both the creature stage with like some fancy brushes over them and like a different way to make it look like it was swimming. But the myth never died. People thought that the aquatic stage was real, that it was about to be in the game. Some of it even got a little conspiratorial, where people thought that like, a day before release, the aquatic stage was there and someone decided to cut it. Some people thought the modding community that we had it, that like we're hiding the aquatic stage or someone could just make it again and that we're just not giving it to people for whatever reason. And when the demo came out, one of the first things that people did was tear it open to look for the aquatic stage. And I can say with just a little bit of satisfaction that there is no hint of the aquatic stage anywhere in the prototype whatsoever. It does not exist. It was never something that Maxis intended to implement in the final game. It was never a real stage. That proves that demo that they showed off was actually just the creature stage. And I think this was very satisfying for a lot of people in the modding community, because we've been telling this to people for literal years at this point, that there is no aquatic stage, that it was something that maybe very early on they cut, that they intended to have kind of more a water-based game mode before the creature stage. So that was a rumor that I think we kind of put the nail in the coffin of. Other aspects, though, of cut content definitely exist in the prototype, most notably the city stage. So again, the stages go cell stage, creature stage, tribal stage, civilization stage, space stage. The city stage looks to be a stage that was going to be in between tribe and civilization, when you would control one city and it looked like it had a lot of like agriculture concepts, and you'd kind of be like managing this one kind of like urban center before moving on to the civilization stage where you control like a bunch of different cities in a nation, more of like kind of like a Sid Meier's Civ game. Now, in retail Spore, there's definitely evidence of the city stage. One of the enumerators for tech level, which is like the level that the most powerful species on a planet is in every given part of the game. So in Spore, while players are playing through the simulation, even if you're in the space stage, there are still other creatures, controlled by the computer that are in the other stages of the game. There's creatures still on the planets. Some planets are still in the Civ stage. You can actually see Civs fighting and then fly out of their planet like you don't care. You can attack them. In between the code that deals with tech level, there was always this tech level 3 for city stage, which was right in between tech level 2 for tribe and tech level 4 for civilization. That was in the retail game. When you go back to the prototype of Spore and you look into the code base, there's all kinds of references to the city stage. There's entire classes that seem to deal with agriculture and some of the gameplay elements that were designed for the city stage. There's all kinds of names. You can see, based on some of the function names, it almost looks like a lot of the underlying logic, especially logic related to things like resources, was either transferred back to the tribe stage or a lot of it was transferred forward to the civilization stage. So in retail Spore, while we had small fragments of the city stage and we had hints that it was still there in the code base somewhere, in the prototype, we definitely have like definitive evidence that it was there. It probably was at some point either a real stage or a real maybe some sort of like stepping stone to the civilization stage. There's some UI elements too. So that's something that maybe in the future someone will look at and piece together enough that maybe there'll be some kind of playable aspect. Maybe they could transfer some parts to the standard civilization stage in retail Spore. But those are definitely two case studies that are the exact opposite of one another. One was the aquatic stage that has become just a legend in the Spore community that we definitively proved did not exist in a playable form. And the other was the city stage. Now, of course, we can't say that Maxis never had any kind of like early plan for the aquatic stage. So I guess I have to qualify that a little bit. But based on February 08, I can say we were correct. The modding community was correct about the aquatic stage. We have not been hiding it somewhere. It's not in the prototype build. It's not in retail either.
That's really funny because the aquatic stage is Sonic CD's R2 and the city stage is Sonic 2's Hidden Palace. That really helps situate it for me. That's great. Yeah, so really interesting. So we've had about half of a year for this modding community to incorporate this new information, use this stuff. Has it resulted in new mods, better mods, improved tooling?
Absolutely. So it's difficult to describe because a lot of people work on their own projects and we only hear kind of hints about it until they come out. But in terms of cutting down the effort of reverse engineering retail Spore, it is indescribable how helpful it is. There are definitely mods that incorporate different aspects of FO8 already. I'd say one of the bigger ones is the Flora editor reconstruction. That's another cut part of Spore, but we knew that this was cut from. This is not a legend. This is not a myth. We knew the Flora editor was there. So again, for people who are not familiar with Spore, you spend a lot of time designing things in Spore. You design your organic creature. You put parts on it. You design what it looks like, its mouth, its eyes, its graspers, if it has, venom, if it has spikes that it uses to attack enemies. You design vehicles when you get to the civilization stage and the space stage, buildings. You have factories, the entertainment buildings in your cities that serve certain purposes. You can design what they look like and make them look however you want. But notably absent from this kind of gameplay structure was designing plants, flora. It was something that was intended to be in the final game. There are still fragments definitely in retail Spore. I've been told that when plants appear in Sporepedia, that they are connected in some way to like the design of what the Flora editor was, but it's not an editor that you can access. We have a very talented modder, Axexia, who went into this and more or less found all of the different models that were used for Flora in the prototype build. They went in and they found all kinds of functions that were related to how the Flora editor was supposed to work in the prototype, and then they imported much of that to retail Spore. I know that there was an aspect of the Flora editor that they had to kind of like build off of. Other people have tried to build off of that too to make a mod, but this is definitely the most up-to-date one. And now, because of the prototype build, we have a fully functioning Flora editor in Spore. So something that you could never do before in the game without modding. Vanilla has no Flora design whatsoever. You can now design your own plants. You can make them look like normal plants, like trees or shrubs. You can make them look very alien, like Spore's plants. You can put fruit nodes on them where the fruit is going to appear. So when it appears in game, if like a creature is going to, reach up and grab to pull a fruit off of a tree, it's something that we've never had to that level. And I know for a fact that the modder who worked on this heavily worked with, the information that was available in the prototype. And then the design from the very beginning was, okay, this is really cool, but how do we take this and give this to players playing retail Spore so they can engage with this aspect of the game that wasn't available to vanilla players?
That's really cool. And how does EA relate to this active modding scene? You mentioned there's a positive relationship between the Spore community and EA. Like, what form does that take today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So EA recently, I believe it was 2025, took a bunch of their older titles and created official communities for them. So there's an official Spore Discord server run by full-time EA staff, and their job mainly is to engage with the community, to run Spore-related events, and they keep the servers running. So to this day, Spore still has online servers where Spore is not a multiplayer game, but you can share anything that you've made to, they call it Sporepedia, where other people can download your creations and play them. So you can, download creatures, buildings, vehicles, adventures, which are the expansion pack to Spore. They're kind of like little mini scenarios that you can play. And you can, kind of interact in that way with stuff that other people have created. So one of their main jobs is running the servers, but also running the community. We reached out to EA very early when this official Spore Discord server was created to kind of like gauge their interest in coordinating with the modding community. And there was actually a lot of interest there. So EA does not officially endorse modding and they don't officially support it, but they also don't suppress modding or kind of like outlaw it from like official EA channels. In fact, I would say the Spore modding community has like an extremely symbiotic relationship with the official Spore Discord server. A lot of people go to official Spore if they need like, help getting online connection in Spore, or maybe they need game entitlements to make sure that the, DLC is recognized on their accounts. They have access to like different parts of the game that are only available in the DLC or parts in the DLC. But a lot of people also, I'd say, anyone who plays Spore for a while, eventually that modding itch kind of comes and they want to change the game in some way. They want access to what only modded copies of Spore can have. So if anyone asks any kind of question related to Spore modding in the official Discord server, the EA managers who work for the company actually point them in the direction of the Spore modding community, and we provide support for them in that way. Players are allowed to talk about modding in the official EA Discord server. They're allowed to recommend mods to each other, post screenshots and videos of modded content. So EA absolutely does not try to interfere with modding. They don't try to discourage people from modding. They're just not allowed to say EA officially endorses it. And we were particularly excited about the model that EA put out with the Command and Conquer community, who over a long period of dialogue was able to convince EA in 2020 to first put out the source code for certain DLL files. For a lot of old Command and Conquer games, some of the old Red Alert games, also Command and Conquer Zero Hour and Generals. And then eventually in 2025, the same year that official Spore was created, they put out almost the full source code for a whole series of Command and Conquer games, and they gave them quasi-official modding support. EA still doesn't encourage Command and Conquer players to mod their game, but they have official modding guidelines that are to be followed. And because the source code is out there, with the exception of some models, so you still have to purchase the game, but the source code is out there to mod from, they have a lot more resources to make mods. We are hoping that EA recognizes how much of a responsible actor the Spore modding community has been. We definitely don't encourage people to, acquire the game illegally. We only provide modding support for legitimate copies of the game. We, send people over to the official Spore Discord server if they have any like official EA questions. We happily provide modding support for free. That is definitely of benefit to EA. Modding has kept Spore alive for many years. It's probably the main reason why people are still so interested in this game, and it definitely drives sales of the game. We encourage people to purchase it, to have a legitimate copy so they can mod it. So we're hoping eventually that that same admirable model that EA applied to Command & Conquer, a limited source code release followed by quasi-official modding support and modding guidelines, could eventually be applied to Spore as well. We think that we definitely have proven that we're responsible in how we handle our community and how we encourage people to interact with EA in the game. And we're hoping that because we have such a good relationship with the company and we're so supportive of them and they're so supportive of us, that eventually that we can get into a dialogue to, take that model that works so well for Command & Conquer and apply it to Spore.
Great points, and I think the Command & Conquer release is really to be praised from a preservationist perspective, but also an enthusiast perspective. I'm not into Command & Conquer, but I did recently look into some of the console ports of it, and having that PC source code available to orient myself in the PlayStation version and the Saturn version made things so much easier, and I found some cool stuff. So I think it helps keep enthusiasm up for these older titles. It maybe might drive enough to justify new titles in the series. I hope more companies do what EA has done with Command & Conquer specifically, and it sounds like the relationship they have with Spore is a positive and also to be praised.
Yeah, it's very, very forward thinking of them.
Yeah, and company representatives who are listening to this, Hidden Palace is a responsible actor and responsible steward of cool stuff you might have in your archives. Get in touch.
There's another aspect of how the prototype helped us with a very specific subsystem that probably never would have been reverse engineered had it not been for the prototype. It's called EAPD, EA Pure Data, and it's a Spore-specific fork of PD, which is a visual audio programming language that's mostly used to program procedural music. So something that's very unique about Spore is anytime that you interact with aspects of the world, it gives you this very unique almost soundtrack. When you put a part on a creature, there's this like rhythm that plays and it's unique to that part. If you take the part off, it's plays a unique rhythm as well. It's very difficult to describe, but it's something that just never has been seen in another game before. It's almost trippy and hypnotic the way that it operates in Spore. And it operates off this like very unique programming language that almost no one uses and has any knowledge of whatsoever. No one wanted to touch it with the 10-foot pole for the longest time because we had absolutely no knowledge of how it worked. We knew that this class had about 1,000 functions and we had labels for exactly 0 of them. So no one wanted to tackle this beast. When the prototype came out, we have all kinds of labels now relating to the EAPD system. We have all kinds of information and annotations and data and all of the stuff that we can work with. So I know there's great interest right now in working with EAPD. And if we're able to implement a subsystem into our modding tools, the Mod API SDK, then we could have this kind of like procedurally generated music and make custom audio files to deal with that. This is not something that I work on myself, but I'm very excited about it because it's clearly something that a lot of the community has been very passionate about. But I think without the Spore prototype, the prospect of someone, manually reverse engineering this already very complex system without debug symbols, I don't see that happening. So that's definitely opened a new door for us too. Something else that was helpful to us that I just have not mentioned at all is the keymap.txt. So Spore uses these FNV1 hashes for almost everything. They're in the package files. They're used for all manner of data. The hashes are very important to us. For the longest time, we guessed on most of them. And I have to say, we guessed right in a lot of cases. But something else that was super nice with the prototype is just sitting in there is keymap.txt, which is a text file with everything. It is just a list of all of these different properties, thousands and thousands of properties, all of these things that are related to these hashes. And we now have confirmed names for all of these. It's super nice. We've integrated them into our modding tools. I think the only area that we don't have there's some areas related to the effect system. There's also a subsystem called Swarm. We don't have property labels for those either. There's various reasons for why those are packaged and more like obscured in the prototype, but keymap.txt is crazy. And again, it's something that's just like sitting there. It's not even something that you really have to like look very hard for, but it's very satisfying when, you have a modding community where we've been doing this the old fashioned way for the longest time. And it's like having the answer key on the tests now. Like, it's just a text file just sitting in there, and we just have access to that now, which, obviously the prototype is going to differ from retail, but our modding tools are very good at, operating with what we have. And we now have definitive labels for a lot more things than just, not, I can't say randomly guessing because it was quite educated, these guesses. In a lot of cases, they were correct, but having that text file is definitely a confirmation. And I can say for my own modding work, something that's been very satisfying is when I went through and I tried to mod something or I tried to change something and I labeled these functions myself and I've detoured these functions and I've, used them and hooked them to make, custom logic and Spore, and I gave them my own titles. It was very satisfying looking through the Gidra project I have now for the prototype of Spore and looking at the confirmed labels to these functions and seeing that I was like largely right in a lot of cases. Like one of my main modding efforts has been to bring a lot of Grox logic to the player. So the Grox, for people that don't play Spore, are essentially the main antagonists of the game. They're this horrifying cybernetic race that lives at the center of the galaxy that, wants to destroy all life and do all this scary stuff. And they've kind of become the face of Spore in a lot of ways. Like when people play Spore, they remember the Grox. They're the most known creature by far. They're definitely a very unique aspect of the game. And a lot of my modding work has been to bring Grox exclusive things to the player empire. One of those was the Grox is it's kind of the opposite of how the player plays. The player wants to terraform planets, spread life. They started as a cell, now they're a galactic spacefaring empire. The Grox can only live on inhospitable planets. They can only live on, they call them Terra Score 0 planets, T0 planets, that are like completely devoid of all their life. They're usually way too hot or way too cold. They're lava planets, they're fiery, they're ice cold. And one of my main modding efforts was to bring this to the player and allow the player to build fully functional colonies and like whole societies on these T0 planets. And in service of that, I labeled a bunch of functions in C Terraforming Manager, which is this class that deals specifically with terraforming logic and the T-score of the planets, so that I could make it so the player could operate full colonies and full empires on these planets. When I went through in the prototype, I found that many of my labels were like right on the money with these functions. And that was like a very satisfying feeling for a mod developer. So that means that I was, right about a lot of these things. But at the same time, I also had a few incorrect labels. I had some data that maybe wasn't what it was supposed to be, or I had mislabeled something. I have now kind of gone well beyond that early modding work, and I have more or less taken the entire C Terraforming Manager class from the prototype and more or less brought over everything I possibly could in retail, to the point that I have like the entire class pretty much like, wrapped up with a nice bow right now. And that's just amazing. Like I am a pretty novice reverse engineer. I got into that side of Spore modding very recently. And to go from not blindly guessing, but doing the manual process, which I can only describe as like, painstaking, to having the answer key now and knowing what all these functions do, that's definitely very nice. It's nice because the harder parts are easy. I can now label things I never would be able to label before. And it's also nice because it's satisfying to know that the efforts that I did before were like largely in the right direction. I have some like, more confidence now that I know that the label is correct and that directionally I knew what the function was doing.
Yeah, if you've never done reverse engineering, it really is sort of like getting into the head of a programmer 15 years ago and thinking about how were they thinking about how this should work, and if I were them, what would I do here, and making these connections that are very hard to describe if you haven't like spent hours and hours in disassembly, but I think the three of us here have.
Yeah, definitely. And in some cases too, to someone who's not a very in-depth reverse engineer or modder, it's interesting to see how something so simple as a function label or a class can like change the entire game. There's some disassembly that I can see in Gidra on Retail Spore, which is just like absolutely foreign to me. I cannot understand any of the direction that it's going for whatsoever. It would take me a very long time to look at this and be like, all right, like what is this function doing? But just having a function name completely changes the game. Like one small example I can give is I've looked into the background DPS system in Space Stage, which is essentially how a combat encounter will proceed if the player is not physically present. So if a huge space battle is happening, in the atmosphere of a planet far, far away that the player controls, what is the outcome of that battle going to be? That was another system that was completely, terra incognita for the Spore modding community. And if you look at the functions themselves, some of them are like, very confusing and do not obviously look like combat functions. But just having a label, something like, say, there's a bomber on a planet, how much damage is it going to do? That function will be named, bomber background DPS. That just changes it completely. Now, if we can find the equivalent of that FO8 function in retail Spore, you don't need to understand all of the disassembly. You don't need to understand everything that the function is doing. You largely know what that function does now. You know that it sets the background DPS for that specific UFO. So you can go through now and you can kind of reverse that entire system without needing to go through like a painstaking process to test. Now, of course, in the modding community, we still do live testing. We go in, we detour and hook the functions. We, do breakpoints. We make sure that, what we've labeled is actually what it's supposed to be. But having the function labels and having the debug symbols absolutely changes the game when you're just trying to figure out how a system works and you maybe don't have infinite free time to, do it the old-fashioned way.
Right. It prevents you from going down blind alleys for hours like, oh, I thought this was game logic, but this is actually just a compression routine.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a mini map or something.
No, absolutely. And like I said, it's so interesting the ways that people are interacting with it. Some people are doing, very small stuff like, okay, like I care about the Civ stage. I want to make the Civ stage better. So let me go in and find this like one specific thing that I care, and I'll make a very small mod to correct something that I've always wanted to do. Other people are going in, like I said, with that audio system. They're going in and they're finding out how does this complex, like EAPD is so complex, that audio system I described earlier, that some of the developers were writing academic papers on how they integrated it into Spore, and like, so that's something that we never would have used. And there's definitely people that are so passionate in our community that are going through and they're finding this like hopelessly complex system with 1,000 functions in the class, and they're going to go through now and use the debug symbols that we have to kind of make sense of it and maybe integrate into our tools. And I think that both are very valid uses of the prototype. You have some people that just want to play it. Some people want to go and they want to see what was cut from Spore, what did Spore look like before it was the retail version. Some people want to go in, and I would say I am a more gameplay oriented monitor. I definitely like extending things that the player does not have access to and giving them access to that. I have a bunch of stuff planned for the space stage, some things planned for the creature stage too, giving us access to things that were never in the game before, and I'm definitely going to be using the prototype for that. Some people like systems. They like going through and saying, how does the audio visual system work in Spore for procedurally generated audio? How can we rebuild the entire Flora editor? How can we go through and infer symbols from base game Spore to increase our knowledge about the DLC, which we don't have debug symbols for? So there's definitely, some people are more systems oriented. They want to, integrate entire new programs into our modding tools. Some people just want very specific aspects of gameplay, and the prototype is definitely going to, like you said, be the roadmap that's going to allow us to do a lot of those things.
One question I had is, do we know what the purpose of this prototype build was? Was it just a Tuesday in February, somebody happened to hit make, or was this intended for magazines or press or something?
We have our guesses. It's funny you brought that up, as a couple of people did venture a guess to me when I was talking to them about the prototype. I think the community is leaning more towards this was probably for a journalist or some kind of pre-release. We don't think this was actually a build that Maxis was using to like actively test the game. There's a few reasons for that. The first being the presence of SecuROM. That's the DRM that Disk Spore used when it first came out. It's there in the prototype. Other reasons, it's not fully unpacked. So some parts of the game, from what I've been told, the parts that deal with like game tuning specifically, are unpacked. So we can look at all of like the files that were in those package files. We can look at the file paths, all of this different stuff related to how that data is set out. Other parts are not. I believe the parts that specifically are not unpacked are more to do with the textures and models. Because everything is not unpacked, we have to assume that the devs were not working with this on like a day-to-day basis to make the game. We don't see any reason why they would want to package everything if they still have to like crack it open and look at the file paths and look at the individual data. Now, of course, there's other theories as well. Some people think that it's only partly unpacked because maybe they were done with those systems already. Maybe they had completed models first, and so they packaged it and they didn't need to go in and do a lot of changes to it. We are more so, I think, leaning to the theory that it was probably for a journalist. To be honest, I don't think a lot of people in the modding community really care where it came from. We would take anything that, as long as it's, legitimate and, not something we're not trying to do anything to mess with EA. But I think we would take any prototype, any information related to Spore that could help us in our, legitimate modding activities. But I think the overwhelming consensus from people who have really looked into the prototype is that we don't think this would be the optimal model if Maxis was still like actively uh, in making the core aspects of the game. Now, that's not to say that the game was ready, because there's lots of parts of the game that are just like not there, like not even like the previous antagonistic empire I talked about, the Groks. They're like more or less not functional in the prototype build. So they don't look like the Groks. They look like there's actually a little creature called not the Groks, spelled incorrectly, that's in Spore. It's like a little penguin creature, and that's who the Groks are in the prototype. Like if you go to the center of the galaxy, the scary evil empire that's going to take over the universe is like a cute little penguin, and you can barely interact with them or do anything with them. So they had a lot of work to do between February and this build and the final release in September. But the community definitely, I think, doubts that this specific build was the build that they were using to like actively test the game internally. We are more leaning towards it was probably more like given to a journalist or given to fancy media people to take a look into the game before it came out.
So it's about 6 months out from the gold release. Is that about the timeline?
Yeah, it was September of 08 that Spore came out. It was early. It was September 7th, I believe. So from February 8th to September 7th, they had a lot in place. They also had a lot that would eventually make it into the final game. And, thankfully, too, there's a lot of things, like a couple of them, obviously, the Groks who became the face of the game were clearly implemented between February 08 and September. Other things, too, that were either fixed or corrected. I think the space travel system in February 08 is like abysmal. It's like when you travel between different stars, it like charges up your, whatever it is, FTL drive or whatever for a minute, and then you like go to the star a second or two later. But that means if you're like rapidly traveling, it's like a 2-second delay every single time you click on a star to travel, which is just horrible. So like someone or a playtester or a developer flagged that between February and September, and now we have our much nicer retail version, which you cleanly band between these stars, flying through the galaxy with no care in the world, and don't have to wait a couple seconds every single time to transfer. So they polished a lot of things between February and September, and we're thankful for that. But at the same time, there's stuff in the prototype build that I think people are definitely going to want to see in retail Spore. I definitely think that couple of things I know the community has talked about. People claim the stars look better in February 08, that they just look more beautiful and dynamic. So maybe some effects to do with the stars that you see in the sky. I know a lot of like small gameplay things, like the size of certain creatures that's been talked about. Creatures have a lot more varying sizes in the prototype build, so maybe we'll see kind of like, epic and rogue creatures, these big, huge monsters that you encounter in the creature stage. Maybe we'll see people like mess with the scale a little bit more. I think as time goes on and as our tools get sharper, I definitely think you'll see more independent mods created with just, stuff that's been reversed from the debug symbols we have from the prototype. And I think you'll see people scrape more from the prototype and, polish it up a little bit and put it into retail Spore as well. I think we're going to see mods go in both directions for sure.
So one of the things I really liked in the prototype was the planet editor. Has anyone tried to port that into the retail?
So it's to my knowledge, when you start a new game in the prototype, there's a little debug console, and it gives you overrides on what your planet is going, like what the template of your planet's going to be. Yes, there's definitely been discussion about putting something like that in retail. There's also in the DLC of Spore, there's the adventure editor, which allows you to customize the planet that the adventure takes place in, but that's not core Spore gameplay through the different stages. That's like a scenario that happens when you engage with some parts of the DLC. But yes, there's definitely plans, I think, to take some of the planet customization present in the prototype build and move it to Retail Spore. We have ways that we can customize our planets currently. There's definitely mods out there that allow you to like mess with the planet that you start on or change like how different planets operate. But I think a lot of players would definitely like more unique starting planets, and that little debug UI that pops up is definitely something that people are interested in. I think when we have more information about how those functions operate and how functional it is in FO8, I think that it would be fairly realistic to bring something like that to Retail Sport. If anything, we already have the groundwork for modifying player homeworld planets, so that would synergize really well with some of the stuff that modders have already been working on.
I'm almost afraid to ask what remains the holy grail for the community. If an earlier prototype could be uncovered, would the battles over the cut feature that wasn't really there, the aquatic stage, reignite?
That's a great question. I think that there's definitely plenty more to do with Spore. So, if anyone's out there sitting on, somehow an even earlier prototype or a different prototype and you want to get in contact with us, please do. But I think from what I've been told, so we have a very talented modder and community manager named Cade, and Cade runs a lot of the Spore community tools. So they run the Spore Community Hub. They host a lot of our modding tools on GitHub. Extremely talented, probably one of the most knowledgeable people about the entire community. Cade was particularly interested in the packed versus unpacked format of the prototype, and how if we had a version in which everything was unpacked, we probably would be able to scrape a lot more information about some of the subsystems that maybe we don't have a lot of knowledge about or a lot of, previous reverse engineering work on. So yes, that would be the holy grail, maybe a fully unpacked version, or if we could get into a relationship with EA on the source code and we could just look into most of the source code. We're really not asking EA to make Spore open source. We don't expect them to do that. We don't want them to do that. We want people to still purchase this game. There's definitely a profitability incentive for EA, but the Command and Conquer model is what we love. They released most of the source code enough that they could mod the game, but not all of the assets. So you still have to purchase these Command and Conquer games, but you can, crack them open to mod. That would really be the holy grail for us. If we had enough of the source code that we had the exact C++ structure of almost everything in the game that we could mod to our heart's content, that would be the true holy grail. But without that happening, we are quite content with the prototype that we have and the direction that the modding community is going. If we could get any more information, people are so passionate about Spore. People love Maxis. They love Spore. They love the game, that they'll be modding this game forever. There will always be new advances in Spore modding, and there will always be new heights for us to release. So I would say people are always on the lookout for any edge they can gain. But at the same time, it's such a collaborative process. Everything that gets done in Spore gets posted in our Discord servers. We share functions that we've found. We share resources. A lot of our modding work is like directly open source. All of our modding tools are open source. Most mods are open source. So the community definitely builds off of what has already been discovered. So while people are always looking for, the next advantage they can get in the mod that they're working on, they do it because they're trying to give the community something that they can enjoy and interact with. They're trying to give new players, a way to play the game that they maybe haven't experienced before. They're trying to give other modders resources that they can use to make their own projects or to work on aspects of the game that they care about. So while I think that we'll always have our eye out for the next big thing in sport modding, I definitely think it's going to be just continue to be a meteoric rise. We can only go up from here. We have all these resources, we have all these passionate people. Sport modding can only get more advanced as we continue, and I think the environment's good for us. We have a good relationship with EA. We have a prototype now. We have a talented team behind all of these different projects, and overall we have a very positive community. It's a constructive community around a shared interest in building things we all care about, and that's definitely, I think, what inspires a lot of people to get involved and to want to participate in this process as well.
Something you said made me realize that the gold standard would be the Command and Conquer model, where there is a good subset of the source release. They retain the assets and the important bits that are proprietary to the company, but the game logic and the stuff that the players are interested in, they can make that available. And let's say you're in charge of that sort of thing at a studio, and you think like, oh, I don't know if I can spare somebody to like comb through and filter out the stuff that should be in or should be out. But I think what this conversation shows is if you just have like some press discs that you sent out that were early that may have like debug symbols and stuff, the community would be so happy with just that. It's just as easy as making that available. The enthusiasts and the experts will do the rest. It should be like as low friction as possible to make preservation a priority. And maybe that's one model is look at what you sent out to magazines and see if you've got stuff for that.
I completely agree with that. And I think to go even further, I think if you're a game publisher or, a developer, any kind of company that puts out games for profit, I don't think they should be fearful of these kinds of prototype releases at all. Because I think the Spore community, if anything, has set a very high bar for how a community engages with content like this. Some people were cautious at first, maybe that EA would be a little upset that we were using this in this way, but that has not been the case. EA has been very good to us. EA has been consistently supportive of us, and I would say we've been extremely responsible with how we've handled the prototype release. We do not encourage people to illegally acquire Spore. We use the prototype release to learn as much as possible about how the game functions so that we can make content for people. And one thing I forgot to mention about the official Spore team, while we know the official Spore team at EA has the original source code to Spore, which is actually a different situation than Command & Conquer. They had to my knowledge, kind of find artifacts of the source code and kind of put it back together. We know that EA has it. They don't have the build machines. So they don't have the original build machines that they use to make package files. So it is already confirmed that EA will not be putting out any more official content for this iteration of Spore. So that means the modding community is the only group that's consistently putting out content. And if you're EA and you're looking at how we've interacted with this prototype, we use it to learn about Spore because we're passionate about the game and we want to make the best content possible for players to enjoy. And that, in turn, makes people want to buy the game. People look at, the stuff that we've made, the mods that they've made, and they've said, wow, when I first played Spore, I never could do any of these things. And now look at what the game has become. Now look at all of these different new programs that I can engage in, new ways I can play the game, new content that's available that otherwise would not have been available if not for the modding community. That's what we use the prototype for. It's to increase people's, attention to the game, to bring more people into the community and to increase their enjoyment of the game. And I think personally that the modding community has been very responsible in our interaction with this prototype and how we've used it. And if you're EA, I would only see benefits in that. Increasing attention to, a cult classic title that still continues to sell well all these years later and bringing people into the, wider EA gaming community through this game that a lot of people still care about.
Great points. Yeah, if you look on Google Trends for Spore game, you'll see interest is higher now than it has been since the initial wave of enthusiasm after its release. And I have to think no small part of that is due to the modding scene and also the flourishing of activity that's come up in the last 6 months. So that seems a good place to wrap up. Biolaser, if people are interested in Spore and playing it and playing the mods, where should they be going online?
Yeah, so the biggest Spore communities are definitely, of course, the Spore official server, where a lot of people can go for base game content, and the Spore modding community Discord server, the SMC. It's a publicly available server. If you look up Spore modding community, there's a million invites everywhere. That's where mods are posted. That's where developers talk about what they're working on, and that's where people collaborate and share information on how we're modding Spore and how we're engaging with the game.
It's a really fun Discord. I've had a lot of fun watching the Spore people kind of dig into the prototype. So if you're into Spore, I recommend.
This has been The Hidden Palace. Thanks for listening. You can recommend the show to other people. You can tune in and subscribe to future episodes. You know what to do with podcasts. We will be back again with more stuff about video game preservation some point in the future. Until then, bye.